Welcome to Novara Live. I'm Michael Walker, and on this Wednesday evening, I'm joined by Helena, No Justice MTG. A pleasure to be joined by you on the show.
Yeah, it's really good to be here. I have just landed in the UK as well, so I am quite jet lagged, but it's always good to be with you on Novara Live, and good to be back in Blighty, where it's actually warmer than it was in America.
Well, what were you doing in America?
I was playing Magic the Gathering. I know it has MTG in my name, but sometimes I do actually play Magic the Gathering sometimes, and it was a pretty good weekend. So
amazing. Oh, that sounds excellent. We've got a great show lined up. I'll be talking with Helena about Ukraine signing a minerals deal, energy bills being hiked, Trump's bizarre AI video about Gaza, which I imagine you will have seen, and Jeff Bezos dictating what can be written in the opinion section of the paper he bought. Before that, though, I'm going to speak to former cabinet minister Claire Short about Keir Starmer's recent decisions. As you know, yesterday, Keir Starmer made the surprise decision to increase Britain's defence budget and slash its spending on aid. Now, the move is widely seen as an attempt to get on Donald Trump's good side before a meeting with the president tomorrow, but it goes against Labour's manifesto, which had pledged to restore the aid budget to the target of 0.7% of GDP when fiscal conditions allowed. That's what the manifesto said. Instead, they're slashing it from its current level of 0.5% to 0.3% of GDP. The move also goes against what cabinet ministers have been saying more recently than in the manifesto. So earlier this month, the Foreign Secretary David Lammy said Donald Trump's own cuts to foreign aid could be a big strategic mistake. But less than 3 weeks later, the same David Lammy was in The Guardian saying that the UK making cuts to aid was in fact necessary. It was a terrible idea when Trump did it, good idea when we're doing it, only 3 weeks in between. As you will imagine, development NGOs have reacted in horror to the move by Keir Starmer, as has former Secretary of State for International Development Claire Short, who told Labour List that these were not the acts of a Labour government. Claire Short was the first cabinet-level Secretary of State for International Development, a position which she held until 2003 when she resigned in opposition to the Iraq War. So she held that job for 6 years. This is going to be a very interesting conversation. I was saying before, I'm not sure if we have had a former cabinet minister on this show before. We've had one on Downstream, Rory Stewart, of course, but I don't think anyone comes to mind for Novara Live, where I've had someone who's going to be, or who has been in the cabinets. This would be really, really interesting. I want to know what the aid budget's actually spent on. I'm going to go to Helena first, actually. Right, Helena, what do you make of this story? Some backlash against Keir Starmer. He's also getting plaudits from other people. Lots of people suggesting electorally this might be a good move, ethically a bit more up in the air.
I mean, it's interesting how even Andrew Mitchell in opposition was saying that it was bad that we were essentially trying to fund future military spending on the backs of the international poorest. It's interesting how Andrew Mitchell seems to care quite deeply about the plight of the international poor. It doesn't seem to care about British poor people when he was in government much at all, but that's by the by. But broadly, I think that the criticism, regardless of the slightly hypocritical nature, is broadly correct, right? The international development budgets and things like these are important for, international soft power for the UK, of course. That's something that we've seen as the Americans be losing by cutting their international development budgets with what's happening with Elon Musk and his shredding of the international aid budget in America. Now, you can criticize the way that we do foreign aid. Matt Kenner did a great interview with Downstream, specifically about how foreign aid is a lot of the time taking money from Western states and giving it to international NGOs who are the ones who make the most out of that money, business interests in these developing countries, rather than actually giving these people the economies that they need and want. But even so, regardless of what you think about that, for international stability, this is important. This is important funding that I think is there to try and mitigate conflict, rather than what we have at the moment, when, as a nuclear-armed island nation, if we're increasing defense spending, this isn't being done to protect our own borders because no one's invading the United Kingdom. This is to get involved in other people's wars more broadly. And I don't think that there is that much support for that in the public. I mean, conflict after conflict after conflict across what the UK has been getting involved with overseas, it's just continually seen massive drops in support. I think our kind of financial military support, like at arm's length to Ukraine, has had widespread support. Other than that, it's not been very well supported at all. And it does seem to me a lot of political groupthink amongst our political and media class that somehow defense spending must go up, it must increase. And we already spend quite a lot, you know. Putting in GDP terms belies the fact that our GDP is very big. We're the seventh largest economy in the world, I believe, if I remember correctly. So at 2.3%, I think it currently is. That's a gigantic amount of money that we already spend on defense. I don't think we really should be spending that much more on defense when Aaron was really well put in today on Twitter, posting footage that he'd taken around left behind areas in this country with high streets completely desolate. There are public services falling apart. I think there are things more closer to home worth defending, or at least creating a country that's worth defending before we start looking and thinking about how much we need to be spending on fighting other people's wars for them.
Yeah, really interesting, Helena. We can go to Claire Short now. Claire Short, welcome to the show. Brilliant to have you on. I know yesterday you were sounding very negative about Keir Starmer's announcement to sort of slash aid and increase money on defence. Could I ask you to sort of lay out that position for us? Why did you think it was such a bad move?
Well, I mean, there's two questions. One is, do we need to spend more on defence? And what I'm very conscious on that of is, despite what has just been said, everyone is saying we should. But in fact, we've got massively inefficient procurement in our Ministry of Defence. And just giving a big number doesn't tell you what ought to be done. So I don't rule out, if America's withdrawing from Europe, maybe the European powers increase the effectiveness of their defence arrangements. I don't rule that out, though I think it needs preparation and thinking through and explaining, and not just suddenly announcing because Keir Starmer's going to see Trump and wants to impress him. But to turn to the money, which has been cut and cut already, that is there for the poorest people in the world in the biggest trouble from climate change and wars and the need for humanitarian aid, and to take their money, I think is unforgivable. And I mean, if Britain wants to spend more on defence, let's tax wealthy people a bit more. So it's a two-part question. It isn't, are you in favour of this or not? It's maybe there's a case for more defence spending, but if so, let's hear it and let's have it considered and let's think what it is, rather than let's have a big announcement to impress Mr. Trump on Thursday. But the other is, it's unforgivable to take the money away from development support.
And you were the first Secretary of State for International Development when it got made into a cabinet level position. You held the role for 6 years. That's a lot of experience. Lots of people watching this, and I have to say, I include myself in this actually. I'm somewhat unsure, what does the aid budget get spent on, right? It can seem quite abstract. Lots of people think, oh, maybe this money is getting wasted, and maybe it's just being used to sort of prop up British interests abroad. What is that money spent on, and why does it matter?
There's massive propaganda at that time. And in fact, in those years, and for a few years afterwards, Britain became one of the most respected players in the international system for the effectiveness of our development efforts, which was joining up with others and helping countries that are very poor because of history, environment, and the rest to provide education for all their children and develop their capacity to run their education system. Tanzania, Rwanda after the genocide, Zambia, a lot of countries in Africa. Africa's by far the poorest continent. And we weren't just spending the money here and there on a few projects, but increasing the capacity of countries to provide their own healthcare, to provide their own education system, and so on. There's also then a chunk, 10%, it's now probably 15%, on humanitarian aid when there's a disaster, either of famine, of natural causes, or the consequences of conflict like Sudan, where not just Britain, a lot of countries put some money into the pot organised by the UN just to stop people starving to death. But the measure of our effectiveness, the effort we made with others, was a massive reduction in the poverty of the poorest people in the world, a massive increase in the number of children in education, girls going to school in countries where they never had before. If you want a sustainable future and less conflict, we've got to do more of that with others, not with something with a big Union Jack on it, but intelligent interventions that help some of the poorest countries who've been exploited and misused in the past to build up their capacity, be better at looking after their people and have safer and more secure countries rather than collapsing into hunger and conflict, which is what's happening at the moment and will happen more.
And I suppose there is an argument that's coherent, at least. I'm not saying it's correct, but it's coherent, which is to say that the situation since the 1990s or the early 2000s has changed. So back then, it was a unipolar world. America and its allies were the bosses. We were the wealthy countries. And then the rest of the world was the developing world, and sort of we distributed aid or whatever. We're in a very different world now, a multipolar one. China is now not extraordinarily wealthy, but much richer than it was. It's not really the West and the rest anymore. And so potentially the idea that we spend so much on aid, maybe that is a thing of the past. Maybe that's anachronistic.
0.5% of GDP. It's not very much. At the moment, it's 15 billion, and actually a third of that goes on housing refugees. It's not enough to change the world on its own, but if every country does their bit, then the poorest countries can be lifted up and become sustainable, and people can have a decent life and not think they've got to flee and risk their lives to move somewhere else because there's no chance of their kids doing okay in their country.
I keep hearing people say that sort of this could be a blow to British prestige because the Chinese might come in and offer this aid instead. Now, I'm against, I should be clear, I'm against these cuts to the aid budget. I think they're wrong. But in a way, I'd prefer the Chinese now to come in and offer the aid if we're not going to do it. Everyone sort of says it like it's a bad thing if the Chinese were to come and replace the aid that we're withdrawing. But to me, I hope they do. If we're going to reduce our aid budget, I hope someone else increases it. I wonder what your opinions are on that.
And of course, America is also slashing its. So, it's not just the UK. And although America isn't a big proportion of their GDP, it's a big economy. So getting rid of all their money is a big loss. China's already in, and it tends to do infrastructure, which is needed. Roads and railroads and a lot of conference centres, actually, which are quite popular. Country like Rwanda has done well economically out of organising conferences, for example. And we were better at doing health and education systems. That's very complementary. Of course, if we're out of it, China isn't going to disappear and is going to become more influential. I think it's better for developing countries that we're all there and they can play us off against each other and not have to do what one set of countries tells them to do. So I think it's a loss, but in those who are just thinking of the world, I think wrongly as a big, contest between big geographical blocks, China will become more significant in the developing world as America retreats, Britain retreats. Other countries are also, some of the Scandinavians who were always exemplary but tiny are also cutting. So times are getting tougher. Climate change is affecting Africa, say, in particular, really badly. And there's droughts, and that leads to famine and lack of food and all the rest. And we're pulling back, us, America, others. So the suffering, and of course, we were the first people who industrialized and helped to start the increase in carbon dioxide and all the troubles that's leading to. It's immoral, and our reputation will decline. We had a very high reputation in the UN and globally and in the developing world for our development efforts. That's shrinking already and now will be over. And this pretense that we're going to be some big player in military, efforts, it would take years to increase defence spending. We're famously inefficient at procurement. And Trump is wrong about almost everything. And of course, he's wrong in his attacks on Zelensky. But he's right in saying we should bring this wretched war to an end. And we should all be working to get a peace that is beneficial to everyone, instead of this ongoing slaughter and destruction, particularly of Ukraine. And it was wrong of Russia to invade, but it's not true it was unprovoked. America and NATO, all of us following on whatever America wants, have been expanding and expanding and expanding NATO and bringing military bases and nuclear weapons up and up and up to Russia's borders. And Russia fell under attack, has lashed out. But hundreds of thousands of young men are being slaughtered, destruction of all sorts of facilities in both Russia and Ukraine, but Ukraine suffering particularly. And Europe doesn't seem to, and Britain doesn't seem to have any idea about how to bring the war to an end. I think that's shocking. Our job with Trump should be, yes, you're right. Now let's get a just peace. Let's get a peace that's beneficial for everybody, rather than, oh, Trump, you're wrong, although we'll grovel to you, but you're wrong to demand a peace, which, I don't know. I think our ability to think strategically seems to have collapsed.
I mean, I suppose the argument that Europe needs to become more independent militarily, I mean, it has a logic to it, because if you've got the United States saying we're pulling back, it's a multipolar world, we've got to focus on China. Obviously, I'd prefer China to just get happy and rich, and we can all not have some kind of world war.
I don't think we should be looking for conflict with China. We should be looking for decent relationships. And of course, they're driving the advances in technology for renewable energy, which the whole world is going to need. But yes, if America was pulling back from Europe, and Europe, who has, Britain in particular, but Europe increasingly has just groveled to what America wanted. Europe did resist the Iraq war, whereas Britain didn't. But on Ukraine and the expansion of NATO, Europe just goes with whatever America wants. And on being pro-Israel and not standing up for international law and getting some sort of justice for Israel-Palestine, but no, always go pro-Israel because America wants. All that is deplorable. So if America was pulling back, and if Europe would say, okay, let's start again, how can Europe be a more sensible country that is helping the world to be more just and have less conflict and bring this conflict to an end and actually look for development? Africa is going to be a quarter of the whole world population by 2050. It's the youngest population in any continent, and it's the poorest. Now, if the world, and it's our near neighbour, Europe, right? 20 odd miles from Morocco to the southern border of Spain. If the world neglects that, instead of getting alongside the best of the African authorities and getting some long-term planning about how that continent can lift itself up, we're not only just being morally lacking, we can't see our own self-interest. So we spend lots of money on weapons to aggravate Russia rather than find some long-term settlement with Russia.
You obviously left Tony Blair's government over Iraq. You were in government, though, at cabinet level for 6 years. How are you viewing Keir Starmer's government, sort of with that history in mind? From your perspective of working with Tony Blair and Keir Starmer, how do you see the current Prime Minister?
Before Iraq, because the economic inheritance was quite good and money was spent on education and health and so on, there were some benefits for people. It wasn't all bad. I mean, the Iraq war and the lies about the reasons for going to war were unforgivable, in my view, and that's why I left it. Where are we with Starmer? I didn't have very high expectations, and I'm disappointed. They don't seem to have any Labour instincts, don't believe in international law in relation to Israel, Palestine, whereas if we stood for international law, we could get some progress in bringing peace and justice there. Nothing on the two-child policy, which I think is unforgivable, the two-child benefit cap. We've got a lot of hungry, poor children in this country. And yes, we can throw money at more promises of spending on defence and so on, but nothing on that. And smashing the Department for International Development, cutting any spending on developments. I don't see a Labour government here at all. So we've got a lack of competence and a lack of principle, I'm afraid.
Do you see anything to sort of, is there anything that you're hopeful about when it comes to British politics, or do you all just see it as...
The one thing that's good is the package of measures for employment rights. And that's good not only in principle, but of course, one of the things that's wrong with Britain and indeed the whole of neoliberal economics is pushing down people at the bottom. So having a lot of very low paid workers and then bringing in lots of migrant workers to low pay to keep that bottom. Well, enlarging the rights of workers will lift that up. And that is extremely good. And I put that down to I think the TUC's lead on this has been superb. And then I think the reason that the trade unions were willing to keep bailing out the Labour Party and voting for the leadership on the NEC was this promise. So But that's good. I'm all in favour of that. The other thing is I think that Ed Miliband's analysis and work on climate change is very good, and we can be proud of that. And the thing about that is it's actually cheaper energy. If we didn't have all these additions put onto electricity bills for other purposes, renewable electricity would offer people cheaper bills as well as being good for the planet. And he understands all that, and I think we should back that. So these are two big good things. But the bad things are many and seem to be multiplying. And reading that book, I don't know if you get in. It seems Max Sweeney is in charge of everything. Everything is based on focus groups. There are no principles or strategies. That's why they failed to do anything serious once they took power, because all they'd been is manipulating to get into power, but without any plans about what to do with it. So that's pretty scary, and not at all. I mean, they don't seem to have any principles that attune with the history of the Labour Party and keep together the great Labour coalition of low-paid people, middle-class people who want a moral society, believe in international law, the UN, and so on. People with a sense that those are the long-term interests of Britain, that kind of strategic thinking. And they're just moving more and more to a sort of knee-jerk, what does Donald Trump want? What are the right calling for? We'll go there and we'll change what we say very frequently so that the kind of commitments that were made to get power are forgotten and ripped up. It's very unimpressive.
And finally, I'll let you go in one moment. I just wanted your quick insight into whether you think that Keir Starmer could be provoking a bit of a backlash when it comes to this cut to aid, because obviously, I mean, the 0.7% aid target was a New Labour thing. Sort of as you said, this was one of the sort of proud legacies really of New Labour. I imagine Gordon Brown is not very happy that Keir Starmer has made this cut. Do you think there could be quite a broad-based pushback against what Keir Starmer has done here?
And you know what else? The Tories carried it on because they were so much trying to detoxify their brand, get rid of the image of the nasty party, and they thought following Labour on development would really improve their image. And now we've got them sort of criticising what Labour is doing. I think, obviously, it's not a mass vote, but there's lots of people who have religious principle of long-term thinking about how to make the world safe and sustainable who'll be very disgusted by this. People don't usually peel off their votes for one simple reason, but if you put Gaza on top of this, on top of doing nothing about child poverty, I think a lot of votes will be peeling off. We'll see soon in the local government elections, and we're already seeing in by-elections Labour doing badly, and I think that will continue. They're clearly fixated on reform and think if they do nasty things, they'll hold on to that vote. I'm not at all sure that that is true. It's very sad.
We're getting lots and lots of positive comments in. It's great to hear from you, but we'll have to let you go. Claire Short, thank you so much for joining us. That was Claire Short. I was about to say that was Claire Short speaking to me earlier today, but obviously that was Claire Short speaking to me right now. I'm a little bit confused. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is set to travel to Washington to sign a deal with US President Trump over ownership of Ukraine's critical minerals. This was Trump giving some of the details of the new deal last night.
What does Ukraine get in return, Mr. President?
$350 billion and lots of equipment, and military equipment, and the right to fight on, and originally the right to fight. Look, Ukraine, I will say they're very brave and they're good soldiers, but without the United States and its money and its military equipment, this war would have been over in a very short period of time.
War fighting equipment and the ammunition, that's sustained going forward for Ukraine, and how long is it sustained?
Well, it could go forward for a while, and maybe until we have a deal with Russia. Look, we need to have a deal with Russia, otherwise it's going to continue. But now when Americans put up their money, the taxpayer money, and the president approves it, we're getting our money back in some form.
That was about what Ukraine gets going forward, essentially a promise of continued US military support until a ceasefire with Russia is reached. But what does the US get? At his first cabinet meeting today, Donald Trump answered that question.
We'll be really partnering with Ukraine in terms of rare earth. We very much need rare earth. They have great rare earth. We'll be working with Secretary Burgum and with Chris. You'll be working on that together. And we're going to be able to have tremendous, this gives us, because we don't have that much of it here. We have some, but we don't have that much, and we need a lot more to really propel us to the next level to lead in every way. We're leading right now with AI. We're leading with everything right now, but we need resources. We have to double our electric capacity. We have to do many things. We have to really triple, if you think of it, the electric capacity from what we have right now, if you can believe it. So I just say this. So the deal we're making gets us. It brings us great wealth. We get back the money that we've spent, and we hope that we're going to be able to settle this up.
They've got great rare earths. The full details of the proposed deal aren't yet known, though some parts have been made public. What we do know is that after tense negotiations between the two countries over the last few days, it moved some way from Donald Trump's initial demands. So earlier this month, Trump said he wanted $500 billion of Ukraine's critical mineral wealth to repay the US for its wartime aid, a figure he says amounts to $350 billion. Now, that demand created outrage in Kyiv, with Zelensky saying the proposal would amount to the extortion of, quote, 10 generations of Ukrainians. After Zelensky rejected that deal, Trump called him a dictator and accused Ukraine of starting the war. And he opened bilateral peace negotiations with Russia, negotiations from which Ukraine was excluded. Now, in the new deal, the US won't get direct ownership of those minerals, but they'll still have a stake. The Financial Times has seen the agreement and report this. The final version of the agreement would establish a fund into which Ukraine would contribute 50% of proceeds from the future monetization of state-owned mineral resources, including oil and gas, and associated logistics. The fund would also be able to invest in projects in Ukraine. Trump's original proposal also made reference to this fund, with the exact same proportion of Ukraine's mineral wealth deposited into it. But crucially, the initial proposal gave the US 100% control of the fund. According to the FT, the new version doesn't yet say how large the US's stake in it will be. And the document also states that the US will back Ukraine's future economic development, and the fund's mandate to invest in Ukraine appears to have been an additional element negotiated by Kyiv. And one thing missing from the deal, however, are future US security guarantees for Ukraine should a ceasefire be agreed with Russia. And from Ukraine's perspective, that's the difference between a temporary ceasefire and a more sustainable peace. They want backup. This was Zelensky speaking earlier today.
Without future security guarantees, we will not have really just peace, and we will not have really ceasefire, what Trump spoken about. And if we don't have it, nothing will work. So we will have nothing. Nothing will work. And I know it. That's why I need it. That's why I said that, okay, I'm ready for, basic things, and we are strategic partners and a lot of things. But I want just to understand what will be tomorrow with us, with our families.
Trump's apparent economic and strategic realignment with Russia may make it impossible to offer those security guarantees, but Ukrainian officials reportedly see a hefty US stake in the country as giving it an interest in ensuring Ukraine's future stability and survival. The value of that stake is also intimately bound up with Russian peace negotiations. This map shows the distribution of critical minerals in Ukraine, with the highest value areas in dark blue. As you can see, around half of those areas are to the right of the red line, meaning they're currently occupied by Russia. So what are these critical minerals? Well, it's not a scientific term, but an economic one. Different countries have different lists of critical minerals depending on their economic and political needs. In 2022, the US list included arsenic for semiconductors, beryllium used in aerospace and defense industries, cobalt, lithium, and graphite for batteries, indium for touchscreens, and tellurium for solar power. Now, that list is updated every 3 years, shifting with the economic and political winds. There are also rare earth elements. That's a phrase Trump has used repeatedly to describe Ukraine's wealth. These are 17 critical minerals considered essential for industries like mobile phones, electric vehicles, and missile guidance systems. These elements aren't actually that rare, but they're scarce because their extraction and refinement is both difficult and environmentally destructive. Their production is currently mostly concentrated in China. And further reliance on China is something the US is keen to avoid. Ukraine may not help that much, though. It has relatively small deposits of rare earth elements, those areas in orange, with its largest seams now located mostly in Russian-occupied territory. Russia, of course, is a country with massive rare earth element deposits of its own. And while Trump's negotiations with Ukraine were underway earlier this week, Russian President Vladimir Putin offered the US access to Russia's mineral reserves, both in Russia proper as well as occupied Ukraine. That's a pretty stark reflection of a possible new political reality, with Russia previously having accused the West of trying to dismember Russia in order to get access to its mineral wealth. Speaking on Russian state TV, Putin said this: "We would be ready to cooperate with our American partners if they showed interest in working together. Russia has an order of magnitude more resources of this kind than Ukraine. Regarding new territories, we are ready to attract foreign partners, and in our so-called new historical territories, which have returned to the Russian Federation, there are also certain reserves there. We are ready to work with our foreign partners, including the Americans there." The new historical territories mentioned there are a reference to the occupied eastern regions of Ukraine. That's potentially a proposal that could please Washington, with officials previously fearing that Russia would give China access to its reserves. But there's another player in the minerals game. This keeps getting more confusing. Earlier this week, the European Union also quietly made a minerals offer to Ukraine, or a minerals deal offer to Ukraine. So following a visit to Kyiv to mark the third anniversary of Ukraine's invasion this week, EU Industry Commissioner Stefan Sejourne told journalists he had offered Ukrainian officials a deal, telling reporters this: 21 of the 30 critical materials Europe needs can be provided by Ukraine in a win-win partnership. The added value Europe offers is that we will never demand a deal that is not mutually beneficial. That story didn't last long, though. Relations between the EU and Washington are currently very strained, and perhaps the threat of what could be perceived as European interference in Trump's deal with Ukraine led European Commission spokesperson Thomas Rognier to quickly shut Sejourne down, saying the next day, quote, "There is no proposal." Rognier also told reporters this: "As with all the EU critical raw materials partnerships that we have, this cooperation is not only about securing supply chains for the EU, but also about fostering local value creation and capacity building in partner countries, ensuring mutual benefits. This is about cooperation with Ukraine and not about any sort of competition with the US." And that sounds a lot like a deal. Helena, this sort of mineral aspect has really only entered into sort of media coverage of this conflict very recently. And now everyone seems to be at it, right? So Donald Trump, when he sort of first said this, everyone was saying, this is wild. You can't just sort of say you want to swap some mineral deposits for military support. Now it seems like, oh, actually that might happen. I heard Donald Trump sort of say earlier today, this would be in Ukraine's interest, because if America has an interest in the raw materials of Ukraine, then it also has an interest in protecting those raw materials from Russia. Russia is saying, well, you don't need to worry about us because we'll give you the raw materials anyway. And now the Europeans are saying, actually, we want those raw materials. Give us the raw materials and then we'll defend you. What do you make of it all?
I mean, there's certainly a lot of kind of Kissinger mutual economic benefit to try and belay conflict, right? That was one of the things he got very right about geopolitics, is the economic inter-alliance as a way of maintaining some level of security. I think it is interesting that at the start of the conflict, we really did talk about Russia's material interests in kind of the rich mineral nature of eastern Ukraine, right at the start of the conflict. Oh, well, they're trying to gain territory for the economic power that it would give them. And all of this discussion previously in the conflict from Vladimir Putin, talking about them trying to cripple Russia because of their mineral wealth, for example, to show there is, as well as a lot of greater Russia chauvinist expansionism in the invasion. There was also a lot of economic interest there too, as well as what happened previously in 2014 with Yanukovych and the Asia versus Europe economic relationships there too. There is a huge economic element to this, and raw materials, I've been saying from the start, has been a very big part of Russia's interest in the territories in eastern Ukraine outside of their chauvinist ambitions as well. With regards to Trump and his offers or demands, in even potentially with regards to Ukraine, I think it's quite, like, it shows you a lot of Trump's approach to negotiations here, in that it starts off with, well, we've given you all of these gifts already, right? You need to repay your wartime debts to us. I'm like, well, hang on a minute. You can't just give somebody a gift and then say, oh, but I have to pay me back for the gift. No, that's not how gifts work, right? There was a strategic interest that America had in Ukraine, and they gave them, and not even cold hard cash, just old military tech that they had lying around and said, here you go. Here you have the old military technology, and then expecting repayment of that in incredibly precious, all of these minerals. They're strategically, geostrategically important. It's very, very interesting to me. Also quite funny as well that it is, you can have the old technology, Ukraine, when it comes to defending yourselves from Russian aggression. But when it comes to Israel, cold hard cash for you, right? We'll help fund your universal healthcare in Israel. Well, we won't fund our own universal healthcare in the United States. But Ukraine, they just have to deal with the second-hand military technology there. And when it comes to America wanting this kind of, this huge stake, this very, very large stake in the mineral wealth in Ukraine post-conflict, once some kind of peace negotiation has been sorted out, this completely undermines the fact that when it comes to this potential EU relationship with Ukraine, that there's been this huge amount of EU military aid that's been given. So if we're going to go with Trump's justification here that, oh, well, we've given you all of this military aid throughout this conflict, right? Therefore, we need access to something in return. There has to be some kind of quid pro quo here. Well, actually, the EU is just as, if not more so, entitled in that same vein. I don't think that they believe that. The statement, I think, was very good from the EU negotiator there, saying, no, we want to have a kind of a win-win situation. We want to have an open trading agreement rather than this level of control in what's happening with regards to what kind of relationship ends up coming out of some potential talks here, which is much more reasonable than what has been proposed by America. What I'd also like to point out lastly with regards to this one is that you probably will hear a lot of European outrage about this. America thinking we can be Billy Big Bollocks and we can come in here and say, we want this, we want X, we want Y. We are the big player in this game. This is the new great game, really, between Russia and America, and to a lesser extent, obviously, China's broader interests that lie outside, even though they've only been kind of tangential to the conflict itself, right? This kind of great game that we've seen with regards to NATO versus Russia in Ukraine. And they'll say, well, you can't do this. America can't you come in here and expect to be able to dictate the terms of everything, which I think is very reasonable criticism. Just because you're a world superpower doesn't mean you get to wave your dick around and be the one who tries to do all of it on your own terms. But all of this undermines the fact that, well, for the best part of the last century, that's been America's approach to the global South for that entire period. It's been entirely at the behest of Americans doing essentially what they want with regards to economic relationships with the global South, using their status as the reserve currency, for example, to extract concessions, to get economic relationships that are mostly beneficial to the US and not to countries in the global South, and crickets with regards to this relationship between America and the rest of the world in a unipolar world. And now there's a multipolar world that's emerging. Suddenly, we're going to see this backlash, and legitimate backlash, to America's kind of more forceful position with regards to these negotiations. I would just like a little bit of consistency when it comes to how America does this with other countries too, rather than just countries within Europe.
I mean, there's a strong argument, isn't there, that sort of Donald Trump isn't really changing US foreign policy that much. He's just being a lot more explicit about what was always really going on, right? So obviously, a big common explanation for why they invaded Iraq was that they wanted their oil giants to be able to have access to Iraqi oil fields. But George W. Bush never said that, whereas Donald Trump would just say, oh yeah, the reason we're doing it is because we want the oil. And so the big difference is you've got this president who's finally making explicit what used to be implicit. It can sometimes seem like we're living in a very unstable world, from increasing geopolitical tensions to domestic turbulence, but nothing feels very reliable. But there's one thing you can always depend on. Every 3 months, Ofgem will raise the cost of your energy. And now they've done it again. From this April, the average annual energy bill in Britain will rise to nearly £1,900. And that means the average household will pay an extra £111 each year. Now, the rise is just the latest in a steady climb in the price we're paying for energy. Bills remain a lot lower than they did in late 2022 and early 2023, when Russia's invasion of Ukraine sent gas prices rocketing, but prices have never returned to the roughly £1,200 a year that we were paying before the war in Ukraine. April's rise will mean that households are now paying, on average, £600 a year more than they were in early 2022. That's a 50% rise in prices in just 3 years. Our energy bills are now the most expensive in Europe, and household energy debts are now at an all-time high. So how are Ofgem justifying the price hike? Well, the regulator's chief executive, Jonathan Brearley, gave this explanation. He said, "We know that no price rise is ever welcome, and that the cost of energy remains a huge challenge for many households. But our reliance on international gas markets leads to volatile wholesale prices and continues to drive up bills, which is why it's more important than ever that we're driving forward investment in a cleaner, homegrown system. Labour's Energy Secretary Ed Miliband endorsed that explanation, posting this online.
The news that energy bills are rising is going to be worrying for many families. It's happening because we're so reliant on fossil fuels, in particular gas. And the markets that determine the price of those fossil fuels are controlled by the decisions of petrostates and dictators. So we've seen a 15% rise in the price of wholesale gas. What's government going to do? We're going to have your back. We're going to expand the warm homes discount to protect vulnerable families. We're going to insulate and have energy efficiency for more homes. And we're going to ensure that the regulator is really tough with those companies so we get best value for money for consumers. And the truth is, the most important thing we can do is stick to our clean power mission. Homegrown, clean power that we control.
Clean, homegrown power that we control. You might want to have a word with British petro giant BP. They've just announced they'll be ditching renewable energy and returning to oil and gas excavation instead. It's disappointing. Well, is it disappointing that BP aren't doing what we want them to do? I don't know. Maybe disappointing is the wrong word. Predictable would probably be more appropriate. Also today, the official UK Climate Change Committee has released its latest report on how we can reach net zero emissions by 2050. This is the path to net zero they're proposing. As you can see, we've already reduced emissions by 50% since 1990, and to be on track to net zero by 2050, the committee says that we need to have emissions that are only 13% of our 1990 emissions by 2040. So the Climate Change Committee, a group sort of set up by the government, advises the government on how to keep to the Climate Change Act, which suggests that we have to get down to net zero. Most of the gains we've made so far were from switching from coal to gas, to power the electricity grid, of course. By 2030, Labour says we should have almost moved entirely from gas to renewable, so that should have greened the electricity grid if everything goes to plan. According to the Climate Change Committee, the next big priority from then will be the transition away from petrol-fueled cars and gas boilers. They say some pretty steep curves are necessary to hit our emissions target. For cars, we'd need to go from 2.8% electric vehicles in 2023 to 80% by 2040. For heat pumps, we'd need to go from 0.6% of homes having one installed in 2023 to 50% by 2040 and then 80% by 2050. So hopefully by 2030, we will have made the grid renewable. And then from then on, we need to make everything else run on electricity, not gas boilers or petrol cars. To find out if the plans when it comes to heat pumps are plausible and possible, I spoke to Emma Bohan. She's managing director at IMS Heat Pumps. And when I started with a very basic question, what is a heat pump?
So the heat pump is the replacement for your gas boiler or any other heating appliance in your home, whether that's oil or LPG, direct electric. It's a unit that sits outside. If you are looking for an air source heat pump, which is mainstream, most houses are suitable, or a ground source heat pump, which sits inside but with pipes underground, and it steals heat out of the air or the ground. Uses the same process that you have in your refrigerator to make the inside cold, although it's in reverse. So it's taking the energy out of the air or the ground, creating through compression and expansion heat, which is then superheated to warm the water that runs through your radiators or your underfloor.
This is going to show how ill-informed I was. I thought in your house it was like having an air conditioning unit, but it's you've got that heat pump outside, but it is still going to your radiators.
That is my heat pump, the grey box there.
Oh yeah.
Which is effectively the back of your fridge in the garden. That creates, if you ever put your finger on the top of a bicycle pump, yeah, and compress the air, then that is what's happening in the back of that refrigeration unit, if you like, which is heating it, which then runs that hot water through your system or through the coil in your hot water cylinder.
Okay, so from the perspective
of minus, what's absolute zero? Minus 273 degrees. As long as it's not minus 270 degrees outside, there's always a bit of heat to steal.
The fact I know so little about heat pumps is potentially not surprising because only 0.6% of us have them. That's another statistic I learned today. The Climate Change Committee says it should be 50% of us within 15 years, at which point, hopefully, my questions would seem more odd or out of place. How do we get from 0.6% to 50% having heat pumps in, I suppose, 15 years?
Yeah, well, I think the Climate Change Committee have hit the nail right on the head with the recommendations that they're providing to government. We need a clear message from government to consumers that heat pumps are the future. We need a clear message that hydrogen for domestic heating is in the main unsuitable and will not be going ahead. We need a skills action plan and confirmation. I mean, Ed Miliband did say the other week that he can't see a view with heat pumps getting cheaper, which is not a surprise to people in the industry. And so we need some confirmation that the current funding available in both Scotland and England is going to remain in the short term. That could be offset in some respects by additional and innovative green financing, which I know a lot of private sector are looking at, which I'm sure the government would be delighted if they step in and can do some stuff there. But, you know, over and archingly is if low carbon heating is the cheapest form of heating, it would become a no-brainer for the people, especially in the able to pay market.
I suppose someone might say, you know, installing stuff, all that new kit, is there a case that actually, you know, it's not necessarily as green as it might seem once you sort of take into account the various sort of, I suppose, fixed costs or that it takes to install a heat pump?
Well, I mean, I think the biggest argument is kind of around embodied carbon and throwing things away. You know, we would never advocate taking your, you know, recently installed gas boiler off the wall. That would be insane. But if your gas boiler is coming to an end, as the Climate Change Committee reports outlined, you know, if it's coming to end of life, then we should perhaps legislate that you can't replace that boiler with something of a fossil fuel nature and that you should replace it with a heat pump. There are lots of things that people could do in the meantime to piecemeal their homes in preparation for a heat pump. Whether that's, you know, radiators that have been on the wall for 35 years. I often joke, nobody cares about the radiator. You don't know where they are in your house because they're hidden behind your sofa or your sideboard until it stops working and then it becomes an issue. Have you looked at them in the last 35 years? Because if you have some new radiators installed as you're doing that room up, you're going to be saving money on your gas boiler because that's going to be a more efficient radiator. Insulating your home is a big thing that you can do, which would reduce the capital cost because you'll need a smaller one that'll cost you less money to run. There's lots of things that people can be doing in smaller increments so that when you get to the point of needing a heat pump, the cost is less and the hassle is less.
And is this a big industry? Is sort of money pouring into this? So obviously, if you've got a government that's saying we're going to massively expand the amount of heat pumps installed, is sort of big capital saying this is where we want to put our money?
For sure. As a company, as I say, that's been in and around the industry for a long time. This was established in 97 and the founder was installing heat pumps in mid 1990s in various trials in the country. We've seen more money pouring through the doors of this industry since 2020 than at any time. Big investments from Swedish in the new company era. Octopus obviously entering the market. All of the big six are now doing some form of heat pump offering. Every day there seems to be a new heat pump company opening. There's definitely, and not just in terms of the installation side, but there's a lot of innovation and a lot of interest in the finance side and a lot of innovation happening there around heat leases, heat as a service, how people can pay for heat pumps in a different manner, say like you do for your mobile phone, where you pay for the capital cost as part of your monthly payment. So there's a lot of different and interesting and innovative things happening in the market. So there is clearly a view. If you look at Europe, we are, as one pundit puts it, you know, we are the what's it called? Nilpois in terms of heat.
Okay.
Yeah, Nilpois. You know, we are the bottom of the league table in terms of the uptick. And some of those European markets upticks have been huge over the recent years. The view is that we can only follow, but we need the government to get behind us with a big loud tin banging heat pumps. My personal view, as I've said it, and anybody who's met me will be bored stiff. We had amazing campaigns for going digital on your TV, such that, if you didn't upgrade your TV, you'll never watch Coronation Street again, and life will be over as we know it. Get yourself digital ready was the strap line. Get yourself low carbon ready. It's not the right terminology. I don't think we've got the right terminology as an industry yet to speak to, Mr. and Mrs. Smith sat on the sofa or whomever. But we definitely need that kind of messaging consistently, because it's important for whether you believe in climate change or not. There's a lot of people who don't, but it's definitely important for energy security. Electricity we can generate here. Gas, it comes over in pipes or big boats.
That was Emma Bohan speaking to me earlier today. I can see lots of you in the comments are very skeptical about heat pumps. Lots of you thinking they're not going to be good enough to heat your home. They don't work in cold weather, etc., etc. Now, I'm not going to claim to be an expert on heat pumps. From that interview, you can clearly tell I was not one. But if you look at the rest of Europe, they must work quite well, right? So I'm going to show you this chart. Norway, more than 60% of homes are heated with a heat pump. Now, Norway, I think, is colder than the UK. Finland, 50% of households are heated by a heat pump. In Sweden, 43%. Estonia, 36%. And then the UK is down at the bottom, 1.5%. So it must have gone up from the 0.6% that was in the Climate Change Committee's report from 2023. But still, that's not many. I imagine if it's good enough for Norway, Finland, and Sweden, it's probably going to be good enough for us. Although only once they make it, cost effective. Although apparently Emma was sort of saying that if you account for the running costs, and then you've got the subsidy from the government, it can work out cost efficient. I'm not here to sell you heat pumps though, but the Climate Change Committee does think we are, at least 50% of you are going to need one by 2040. So that's something to think about. US President Donald Trump hasn't held back on his future plans for Gaza. The Riviera of the Middle East is how he's described it, promising luxury developments and plenty of jobs in the enclave. That's after, of course, he's ethnically cleansed it of the 2 million Palestinians who own it. And besides being illegal, immoral, and involving multiple war crimes, you might find the president's real estate fantasy pretty hard to imagine. Well, not to worry. Trump got AI to imagine it for you and posted this on Truth Social last night.
Set you free, bringing the light for all to see. No more tunnels, no more fear. Trump Gaza is finally here. Trump Gaza shining bright, golden future, a brand new life. Feast and dance, the deal is done. Trump Gaza #1. Trump Gaza shining bright, golden future, a brand new life. Feast and dance, the deal is done. Trump Gaza #1.
Oh, I mean, politically despicable, but also having Trump and Netanyahu sort of sitting toplessly, reclining in those little panties while they eat cocktails on the beach. Helena, everything about that was, disgusting visually, politically, ethically. What was your response to seeing that the first time?
I mean, it's one thing having burgeoning monstrous demagogues out there to cause the most kind of grave human rights violations and international crimes possible. It's another thing to have monstrous burgeoning demagogues out there to try and cause as much destruction and engage in multiple crimes against humanity who are so insufferably cringe. This leaving aside like the moral quandary, because clearly the moral side of this is despicable. It's utterly despicable and insulting and offensive. But just the obsession with the usage of like AI to do these things makes it like so artless. What's the market for this? The music in the background too. It beggars belief to me that anyone looks at this and takes it in any way seriously, and yet people do. The people who support Donald Trump, the people who support this sphere of politics, this far-right sphere of politics, they all use this AI. Andrew Tate was doing the same with his silly party launch as well. And they get taken seriously when they do it, despite the fact that it's just... words can't describe. Words can't describe just how ridiculous what we just watched was. And then what's instructive about this, on a more serious note, what is really instructive about this is the kind of things that this represents is how people in these positions of power, people like Donald Trump as well. It's how they view other people, other cultures, other countries as pawns, as playthings, as things that they get to decide. We saw earlier with regards to Trump being able to think, well, I can do what I want with Ukraine's resources. That's my role to be able to do with that. And when it comes to Gaza, when it comes to the Palestinians, they're even less human with regards to how he views them. Their home, their homeland, the place that they have been living under military occupation for decades and decades and decades, right? It's nothing to him. It can be used as a cheap prop for him to sell with AI slop to his sycophantic supporters on Truth Social. And any amount of reverence or any amount of discussion of what Palestinians want, about what their view of what their homeland should be, is completely irrelevant to be plastered over with gaudy, revolting, and incredibly cringe pictures of him and Netanyahu drinking cocktails on a Sunland just by a gaudy hotel. It's so disgusting, and yet all the overwhelming sense I have is just that it doesn't feel even real to me. Just the level to which it's so. This is an international conflict that we're talking about. This is a genocide that's been happening in Palestine. And to people like Donald Trump and his supporters, it's just another fucking gimmick, right? That's what's so disgusting about this.
No, I mean, yeah. I mean, incredibly gross. I mean, obviously, you know, the fact that kids' homes are getting bombed and, you know, tens of thousands of people have been killed and Trump is threatening to kick them off their homes is the real outrage. But then making this gaudy video about it kind of as a joke when you're the most powerful person in the world is very, very despicable. When Amazon owner Jeff Bezos bought the Washington Post in 2013, he said he would be a hands-off owner. And in 2017, after the election of Donald Trump the first time around, they adopted this slogan. Democracy, they said, dies in darkness. The implication was then clear with a demagogic president in the White House. The fourth estate needed to be stronger than ever. But for Trump, round two, Bezos has taken a very different approach. So in October, before the election, Jeff Bezos received backlash from journalists at the paper after blocking an editorial endorsement of Kamala Harris. Instead, for the first time in 36 years, the paper decided not to endorse. And today, Bezos has set out new rules for the opinion section more generally. Now, he wrote this letter to the paper's staff, which he also shared on X. So he said, "I'm writing to let you know about a change coming to our opinion pages. We are going to be writing every day in support and defense of two pillars, personal liberties and free markets. We'll cover other topics too, of course, but viewpoints opposing those pillars will be left to be published by others. There was a time when a newspaper, especially one that was a local monopoly, might have seen it as a service to bring to the reader's doorstep every morning a broad-based opinion section that sought to cover all views. Today, the internet does that job. I am of America and for America, and proud to be so. Our country did not get here by being typical, and a big part of America's success has been freedom in the economic realm and everywhere else. Freedom is ethical. It minimizes coercion, and practical. It drives creativity, invention, and prosperity. I offered David Shipley, so he's the current opinion editor, whom I greatly admire, the opportunity to lead this new chapter. I suggested to him that if the answer wasn't hell yes, then it had to be no. So basically, unless you'll do everything I say, no. After careful consideration, David decided to step away. This is a significant shift. It won't be easy, and it will require 100% commitment. I respect his decision. We'll be searching for a new opinion editor to own this new director, in short, to go along with everything I say. And he says, I'm confident that free markets and personal liberties are right for America. I also believe these viewpoints are underserved in the current market of ideas and news opinion. I'm excited for us together to fill that void. So the idea that in like corporate America, you've got no one advocating for free markets and personal liberty seems a little bit strange to me. Helena, obviously, you know, this very much goes against what Bezos said when he bought the Washington Post. What's interesting here, though, is I think him being so explicit, because if you wanted to, if you wanted to run a respectable newspaper and sort of have some influence on what was written in its pages, you would probably do that a bit more subtly than this, right? And you can clearly have, it's probably more effective ideologically to have 95% of your comment pieces being very pro-free market and pro-individual liberties. I mean, you might argue that free markets and individual liberties aren't actually necessarily the best things to always go together. Maybe A welfare state helps people have individual liberties, for example. But anyway, putting that to one side, ideologically, it's more healthy and coherent to put 5% of people disagreeing with you, because then you look like a sort of legitimate source. People are more likely to trust you. People are more likely to buy your paper, probably. Which means, to me, this seems like the reason he's made it so explicit is because he wants Donald Trump to read this and think, aha, Jeff Bezos, he's one of my guys.
I know, but the thing is, Donald Trump isn't really that focused on free marketism as a kind of political ideology, mostly because Donald Trump doesn't really have a political ideology outside of what's best for me. Do people glaze me enough? Which I think is why he likes billionaires, because they glaze him and they fund him, right? But it is funny to me as well for Jeff Bezos to go, oh, well, we don't get much coverage of free markets and personal liberties. And it's the one acceptable opinion in both the US and in the UK more broadly. The only acceptable political opinion is the markets must be free. The freer the market, the freer the people. Even when you do state intervention, you have some level of, welfare state, as you say. Like, that's still under the premise that everything is free markets. You have right to work states. You don't have any state control over the economy itself. You just redistribute a little bit on that free market basis. Very funny is if they think that anything less than that, we've moved towards this kind of socialist thing, right? So very, very weird to me. But then obviously for us on the left, this shouldn't be surprising. It shouldn't be surprising to us that we see manufactured consent in action. And for Chomsky or Parenti, we all know that the foundation stone of the news media within capitalist economies is such that they are representative of the cultural hegemony that pushes them to their place, right? It's the material interests that underlie news media that informs the ways in which that they create content, the way they push narratives, the way they do these things, right? The problem, of course, is what we on the left have tried to do for ever since these kind of seminal works on news media by Parenti and Chomsky have been within the public zeitgeist, is to impress upon liberals that these are material relationships. This is about the interests that underpin those who own news media and what they own news media to do. And this, you can see this throughout liberal and conservative outlets and the way in which that they present content. Doesn't matter whether it's people at Global Media or whether it's people at GB News and things like that, right? They're still all owned by liberals who support these kind of things. So you get more pro-liberal, more culturally hegemonic narratives being pushed by these newspapers. And the problem with all of this is that Jeff Bezos coming out, as you say, and making the implicit explicit allows liberals who otherwise we could try and get them to understand the material relationships, the systemic reasons for why news media is pro-free market and pro-capitalist, is that they can now go back to what Ken Martin from the DNC was saying all those weeks ago, right? Well, these are the bad billionaires, right? We have the bad billionaires in control of the press, and Jeff Bezos is coming in here and controlling what the Washington Post want to do. Previously, incredibly free, right? It was incredibly free paper. People could say what they want. They had all these different opinions that were being presented here. Jeff Bezos, he's the individual who's the problem here, right? He's the individual who's the problem. I saw Christine Jardim from the Lib Dems talking about how Elon Musk is bad and Jeff Bezos is bad, but Andrew Carnegie, they had a moral conscience. Well, no, he's just trying to create a self-system that would keep them at the top, right? Billionaires are policy failures. And unless, whilst there is still an evil person at the top that these problems can be pinned to, a malevolent actor rather than a systemic issue that's at play here, it's going to be difficult to convince people who would otherwise be amenable to the idea that news media is pushing a certain kind of politics, that it is a nature of capitalism itself or a nature of the systemic relationships between people rather than the fault of one single or a couple of malevolent actors who are part of the bad team, for example, the Republican team, rather than the Democrats who used to be in control of a lot of the news media in America, who are still obviously very pro-free market.
Yeah, I don't know. Who are the good billionaires going to be? Mark Cuban. And then, is he even a billionaire? I've never quite understood where he got his money from. Bill Gates. But Bill Gates is also sort of being quite warm towards Trump now. The vibe shift was real. Helena, let's wrap it up there. Thank you so much for joining me this evening. It's been a pleasure as always.
Always a pleasure. Yeah, absolutely. Good to be back. Good to be back. And thanks for having me on the show.
Thank you for being on. Thank you so much for watching. Come back tomorrow at 6 p.m. For now, you've been watching Novara Live. Good night.